I'm Ryan Patrick Hooper. I host a show called In the Groove on WDET. Thank you. I don't know how that man was allowed in this building. I don't really get nervous a lot, but this week, hanging out with Gilles Peterson right here. I think you guys know who this guy is. For me, definitely a North Star of radio, a huge influence for me in radio. And I know a lot of you guys are big fans of his. For me, it was during the pandemic. I'm a recent convert, really, to Gilles Peterson and his curation on BBC Radio 6. That's where I discovered him. Because what did we do during the pandemic? We got stoned and walked around the Belle Isle Woods a lot, or at least that's what I did. And I got to a point where it's like you have all this music at your fingertips, and I hated all of it. I was like, I'm so sick of all the stuff that I've listened to, because our lives were changing so much, and yada, yada, yada. So I needed that curation. And a friend of mine turned me on to Gilles and his show. And listening to that really changed my life, because it was like, oh, these different styles of music can go together, and there doesn't have to be these dumb ideas of rules or making things sort of be in a box. And that may seem obvious, but I think we've all had that moment where it's like, boom, it can be different. And Gilles was certainly that for me. So I really want to welcome Gilles to this conversation, and just so grateful he's here at Spotlight all week.
Very nice, very nice. Thank you so much, Ryan. It's funny because I was saying you were nervous meeting me. I was interviewing Wendell Harrison just now. I was nervous before I met him, so it goes round and round, right? It never goes away, man.
Gilles came on In the Groove on Wednesday, and I said, man, I almost feel stupid playing music in front of you. Like, this is insane. Like, I'm picking music in front of you. And Gilles looked at me and he said, I have to DJ for 5 hours in Detroit. How do you think I feel? He's going to be DJing here tomorrow night, 5 hours. It's going to be absolutely incredible. But I do want to start just getting to know your background a little bit, because the way radio here in the United States is, it's very different from your background of basically having to be a pirate, of having to go rogue and create your own thing. And I know that's a big question to open up with, but just give me the starting point of how you first were starting to think about radio and how you had to go about doing it.
Okay, well, it's kind of interesting already if you go back to the beginning of how I started, because first and foremost, I'm French Swiss, and I was brought up in London because my dad was working for a Swiss engineering company, and I was born in France, but I was brought up in the French education system at the French Lycée in London. And what that means is that I was completely separated, or I didn't kind of know much about youth culture, British youth culture, until I was taken out of the French system and put into the English education system at the age of 11. And suddenly I don't know why my parents did that. I still don't quite know why they swapped me halfway through my important years of growing up. My brother hadn't done so well in this school, my older brother, so I think they probably thought, get him out of the French and put him in the English. But it basically meant that from the age of 11, I had to relearn how to write. I had to pass quite a lot of extreme tests to get into a particular English school. And then once I got into that school, fortunately for me, I was immediately faced with a different way of socializing, where suddenly I had to belong to something, a music scene in particular. Even at the age of 11, 12, to be accepted at school, you had to be good at sport, or you had to be into some form of music, and you had to wear the stripes and the uniform with that music, whether that was being a mod, a skinhead, a punk, a soul boy, one of three in my entire school. And so that's really how I kind of got I was also, funnily enough, I was actually quite good at sport, so I managed to make it into the school team, and I, luckily enough, met a couple of people who introduced me to Bobby Caldwell and Maze Records at the age of probably 13. And so suddenly I found a uniform, a music, an identity, friends, and then my friend said to me, you should listen to this one radio show. There was only one show on the BBC at the time, which was by a guy called Robbie Vincent, and he presented a show on a Saturday morning, local radio, Radio London. And so that's where I heard jazz funk and imported soul records. I even heard he used to play Japanese jazz fusion records that we used to sort of get excited about. And then from him, I discovered a pirate station that was called Radio Invicta, and it was the first FM pirate playing soul music in the UK. And so there's a difference between FM and medium wave pirates. So if you've seen, there's a film that came out a few years ago about the medium wave pirates, Radio Caroline, the ones that actually used to broadcast from the middle of the sea. And that's not what I was doing. We were doing the inner city pirates, which was basically on FM, and you'd have to go up the top of high-rise buildings, and you'd put your aerials up there, and you'd broadcast, and you'd wait. You know, like if you were lucky, you'd broadcast for 6 hours before being busted. If you were unlucky, you lasted 2 hours. But anyway, my initial sort of seduction of this was by finding Radio Invicta on a Sunday afternoon at the age of 14 or something, and they were playing Herbie Hancock just around the corner, and the DJ was called Andy Jackson. Andy Jazzman Jackson was his name, and never forget it. And so then I became completely obsessed by this one station that played music that I wouldn't hear anywhere else on the radio in the UK. And so from that moment onwards, really, I wanted to be a pirate. I wanted to own turntables. And so when my parents went away for their 30th wedding anniversary or whatever it was at the time, I was the youngest of three. They went away for the weekends, and before they went away, in the garden shed, you call it a yard here, in the yard shed, I had a little electric railway set, very cute, and I used to like train sets. I still had it at that age, right? And they came back from their wedding thing, and the train set had gone, and there was a Citronic Thames mixer, 2 decks, which had a cassette recorder, and I'd suddenly gone from being a little train set devotee to having my own setup, and I even had disco lights to go with it. And so, but I had to buy it on hire purchase, which is a way of paying every week £5 or something. And so the only way I could kind of pay it back was to have a shop in the local fruit and veg, a job in the local fruit and veg shop. And I used to do weddings, and I was that kid who would go and play at people's weddings when I was 15, basically. And then, sorry, long answer. And you asked, and then the next thing I did was I got hold of an engineer through these old electronic newspaper magazines that sort of focused on CB radio and stuff. And on the back pages, you could find out people who built you these illegal transmitters. And I managed to get hold of somebody, gave him £25. Or got £25, and then he built me a transmitter, and then I started broadcasting with my friend next door, and we had our first pirate station, and it was called South London Radio, and that was it. And so just to conclude that, how I kind of got to the next stage was obviously we had to broadcast from a high spot to get some sort of response. So we lived quite near to a place called Epsom Downs, which is in South London, where they have the horse racing. And my dad took us, my friend and I, up to this place called Epsom Downs, about 5 miles from where we lived. And we put we recorded a radio on a cassette, C90 cassette, 45 minutes I was on side A and my next door neighbor was on side B. I was doing jazz funk. He was doing like a John Peel indie alternative show. And his real name was Ross Tinsley, and he changed it to Ross Travone because we were pirates. And I had to change my name because my name is a Swiss-German name, is Merle. And so there's only one of my name in the book, in the phone book. So I changed my name to Peterson because my girlfriend at the time was called Natalie Peterson. And I was in love with her.
A romantic.
She never knew really, but we'd already split up by then. And and so I became Giles Peterson, and that was the 90-minute show. 45 minutes me, 45 minutes him. And then my dad would drive us up to this place called Epsom Downs. We'd get a phone box. But before we got the phone box, we found a tree. We connected our aerial onto the tree. The aerial was connected to the transmitter. In between that, there was a cassette player that we pressed play on. And that would basically broadcast to South London, and on the pre-recorded shows we'd give a phone number out, which was the number of the phone box, which was like 100 meters next to the pub. And then my dad included, we'd all go into this little phone box and we'd wait while the tape was broadcasting for a phone call, and we got one phone call and that was it. I was hooked. That was it. We were reaching people, and just to finish that bit off, so we broadcast a few times in this way, and then this radio station I was talking to you about called Radio Invicta, the one I listened to, the people who built their transmitters was the person who built my transmitter, and they got busted. Radio Invicta got busted by the Home Office, which is the DTI, Department of Trade and Industry, who are the people responsible for taking down the pirates. They got busted and they didn't have a transmitter, and the engineer said to them, "Oh, there's this kid who I made a transmitter for him. Maybe you can borrow his." So they called me and they said, "Can we borrow your transmitter?" I said, "As long as you give me a show." And that's how I got onto Radio Invicta when I was, I think, 17 years old by then. Yeah.
That is why that man is an OG. That's insane. That's very different than me lurking around the WDET offices as an intern trying to get a job. I was not climbing into trees. I was not doing illegal broadcasting. Very different beast entirely. But the thing I keep thinking about when you're telling these stories is that decades later, I'm having that experience of still discovering new music through the radio, just like you did back when you were a teen. And that's still so important today. Like, we are absolutely just bombarded with content constantly. And we were talking about this the other day, that people are still looking for that idea of curation, of someone to go through, 60,000 songs that are uploaded to the internet every single day, plus records that we haven't even discovered yet or being reborn or reissued. So can you talk a little bit about that idea of what curation is for you still today and why that matters?
I found myself over 40 years really in a position where I can do this sort of thing, where people ask me this. And I've got a career which has led me to a place where I have a certain voice to champion music and to celebrate music, and I love that. It's a beautiful thing, that place that I find myself in. What I find is particularly interesting for me at this point in my career is that I still do my equivalent of pirate radio, which is the shows that I do on Worldwide FM. And I also do a show on the BBC, on BBC Six Music, which is a privilege, because I think being on the BBC at a time, especially, I've been there for 25 years now, I've seen the kind of peak of the BBC and peak of radio in a way. I just caught the end of it before the internet really came through, where you could play a song on the radio 2 weeks running and you could pretty much get it in the charts in the UK because it had that much influence. Evidently, people's tastes in listening changed in the last 10, 15 years, 20 years. And now I'm at a station called BBC Six Music, which is kind of the last bastion of curation in that way from a BBC perspective, which has a certain admiration globally. And the BBC's always been pretty, especially certainly in my time, they've been pretty front-footed in terms of using technology. So they were the first ones to really, I think, stream around the world. I mean, probably others were as well, but because the BBC is such a strong brand, people would sort of go towards it. So I felt the strength of that when it was beginning to happen. But right now, with Six Music, as people's tastes need to be constantly developed, and they have so much. There is so much noise out there. So much stuff is just being thrown at people. I think that there's a sort of return to curation where people have just gone, you know what, the algorithm's not working for me anymore, and I need to be led in one way or the other. And by being on Six Music, for me, it's quite a privilege because, you know, I am still finding ears outside of my echo chamber. And in a weird way, that's the key really for everything. If you can try and find a way to get out of your echo chamber to a place which is going to find new ears. And I do that by being on the BBC or by doing music on, you know, like, I don't know, GTA 5 on a game. Those are ways, or by DJing in venues which might not be applicable to a DJ like me, where you're going to be able to find people who might not be expecting a DJ like you. So for me, that's the thing that I'm always searching for. But again, to answer your question, I think that I think people, you know, I mean, again, yeah, I'm in a lovely position, and I'm at that crossroads as well, which is what I was going to say, where there's so much new music that I'm super excited about, but there's also a responsibility to tell the story of how we got here, and so I'm at the point where I can interview Wendell Harrison, but I can also have a night like we're going to have tonight with a bunch of emerging artists that are going to inspire me as well. So for me, my job in a way is to kind of make the join between just to make those connections with legacy, but not being stuck in that. That's the thing to think that I'm always trying to do. Whether that's in my festivals, you know, to have Dee Dee Bridgewater playing next to Belle Cobain, to have you know, the Strata East All-Stars playing alongside Ezra Collective, or whatever it is, to have Kenny Dixon Jr. and Moody Man and doing an amp fiddler tribute next to a bunch of kids doing brand new drum and bass. You know, for me, that's where it gets exciting and interesting.
And I think there is this idea of, yeah, genre matters less and less. You can see it with artists who get frustrated by, I don't want to be called this, that's not what I'm doing, I'm just trying to make good music. But why is that so important to make sure that these things are juxtaposed against each other? Why is that still such a radical thing? Because your festival, like We Out Here, I mean, that's doing that, but you don't see that all the time. It's not happening regularly. It
is happening, though. It's changing. I think it is changing, and I think that, you know, I mean, it's funny, I got a great poster from a shop the other day, which was MC5 and the Sun Ra Orchestra playing in 1967 here, and it's, you know, it's been happening forever, right, in a way. But I think in sort of, yeah, in recent times, you've got, you know, all these different little scenes that are coexisting. But I do think that the taste in people's taste is sophisticated, because people have been able to get to, they've been able to get to John Coltrane a lot quicker than I could, you know. I just think that certainly from the perspective of a festival like We Out Here, you know, we're beginning to see that there is a real demand for that kind of curation, and I think I'm seeing it more around the world. That's a positive, I think.
when you're looking at the idea of what to play, I keep thinking of gatekeeping. People talk about gatekeeping all the time. You have people in power who decide what ends up getting played on the radio. And people wonder, like, okay, why does he get to pick? Or how do you wrestle with that idea of actually selecting the things that you're going to play?
The biggest problem I've got is I get very excited. I mean, this is a problem running a record label and being a DJ or a radio broadcaster. Is I get really excited by something that's new. So if it's my label, I want to sign it, and I'll sign it. But then it's like shit. There's a second album and a third album, and I've got to maintain my excitement. So sometimes it's difficult to maintain that if you've got my personality. So, I'm proud to have done 5 albums with Zara McFarlane. Or, I'm always pleased when I can kind of go a distance, because I'm about like sticking with things as well. It kind of goes against what I'm saying, but it's this kind of weird thing. And from a radio perspective, what I find quite difficult is when I champion artists and they are very grateful. I don't know whether it's a Michael Kiwanuka or whether it's a Sampha or whether it's a Theo Parrish. I love to sort of champion them because it's amazing music when I first hear it. But 3-5 years later, they're still making amazing music, these people, maybe better music. But there's a bunch of newies who've come along that I need to put my energy into. So suddenly, some people, I don't know, people like Jordan Rakai, for example, or a lot of the UK jazz guys, maybe Ezra Collective, I might not play their new track because everyone else is playing it at this point. But sometimes I'll bump into them and I can see in them, they look at me and they're like, you're not supporting my music, are you? And it's like, I really hope they understand. And most of them do understand that because they've already reached another level. And but it's like letting go bit as well. I find that's quite emotional and quite difficult because you do build relationships with all these people. And, I don't know, like a Bad, Not Good, for example. I just got an email from Alex with a bunch of new Bad, Not Good tracks. And I hope I'll play them. But I might not play them as much as I would have done 10 years ago, even though actually that's not a great example because I think that they're generally very, very good. And what I like about Bad, Not Good is that they write really well. So sometimes they can go beyond just the moment by actually writing something that's very notable now, which I can't let go of and I have to play. But my whole thing is the balance between like making sure there's enough room in the show. I did someone wrote a book during the pandemic. There's a listener who lives in, he lives in Hamburg. It's called Pat LaBouche, and he sent me this book. Which is like 500 pages deep. And it was literally every track I've played since I've been at the BBC with stats, like most played artist, most played song, most supported actor. And it was quite interesting. Fun enough, the most played artist that at the BBC is Sun Ra. Which I was particularly proud of, by the way, because I hadn't worked that. So he always managed to, I always find a space for that. But the most interesting thing that he said to me was that 1 in 4 songs that I play is by an artist that I've never played before. And so that to me was really interesting because it said to me that I'm still, I haven't got too caught up in my nostalgia or too caught up in supporting, friends and associates, whatever it is. So that was quite an interesting stat.
Maybe everyone in this room understands that idea of like next person up that you're talking about, of making space for those young artists, but I really need you to go into like the big idea of why that is such an important thing to you. Is that the book right there?
That's another book.
That's the book you wrote during the pandemic. We're going to talk about that.
Yeah,
But why? Yeah, I mean, go into the big idea of why you make so much space for that. Why that's so important.
Well, I think it's also to do with how I grew up and the fact that I grew up at a time when we were being educated music through the DJs that was coming from different parts of the world, a lot of imports, but there was also a scene in the UK which was called Brit Funk, and Brit Funk was a period which was pretty much from 19. This is, you've heard of Simande, the group Simande. I don't know if you. Well, they came a bit before Brit Funk, but there was a period between 1978 and 1982, which was renowned in the UK for punk music, and punk changed everything. But while punk was happening, there was a Brit Funk movement that was happening as well, and I was going to the Brit Funk parties and events, and Brit Funk was basically a live band idea. They were bands, and they were influenced pretty much by American funk bands. So whether it's a group like Dayton or Cameo or Earth, Wind and Fire, all these groups were being played by the DJs on pirate radio stations in the UK, and a bunch of bands decided to do their version of it. And that was what became Brit Funk. And for me, as someone growing up, yes, I went to clubs, I went to pubs where they had DJs playing, and I loved that sort of spirit. That was very important. But I also went to see bands playing, and I kind of could identify with that band thing. And so I took that into all the things that I did later in life. So from being a DJ primarily on pirate radio and doing clubs and being a guest DJ and playing at all-dayers and festivals as a DJ, I was also running a record label. And running record labels was about developing artists, and it was about A&R. It was about, taking it to that level. And all the clubs that I did, from Dingwalls, which was a legendary, a club that I did on a Sunday for years, and the WAG Club, all the clubs I played at in the UK, we'd always have DJ culture and live music culture together. And so I can't quite remember what your question was, but
Keeping space for the rookie class.
what was it?
Well, the new artists are coming up, making sure that they have the space and really being
and
militant about that.
And that's why the live music thing was important, because it allowed, there was always room and space for the new artists to be able to have a start in those events that I was putting on and organizing. And that was also in parallel with me working in the music industry, where I was balancing DJ culture with live music culture and jazz culture. So I think those were the things that kind of maybe were different that I was doing to all the other DJs making labels. Or I was very, I set up a label called Acid Jazz, which signed Brand New Heavies and Jamiroquai and Galliano, a bunch of groups like that. Before I did my first label, Acid Jazz, it wasn't actually my first label, but it was the first label of note. Before that, I was doing a lot of compilation albums, and they were basically mix tapes, or before the DJ's name was on the front of the sleeve. So I was doing albums of collections of music, which the first of which was called Jazz Juice, which was on a record label in the UK called Street Sounds, and that was a label that was the first label to put all the electro, all the early house records on compilations, which made it affordable for people, because these records were expensive if you were going to dig for tunes or dig for music coming from America. They put them on compilations. And so my first actual mixtape was in 1984 or 83, and it was called Jazz Juice. And that was actually mixing all the kind of jazz tracks that I was playing in the clubs. So I'd be putting Brazilian tracks on there, I'd be putting on some bebop, some Charles Erland, some Last Poets, some Sergio Mendes, really sort of quite interesting, looking back on it, selections. And that would be sold to the kids, who basically would buy it because it was on a label that they bought their electro on, and there'd be this series called Jazz Juice. So that was kind of my first entry point. And then I started doing all the early albums for Blue Note. Blue Note saw what I was doing with this thing called Jazz Juice, and they thought, hang on a minute, we've got this massive catalogue, and we've got this kid who's like 20 years old who's basically selling the jazz to a whole new generation of kids. So they were like, let's do the rest of Blue Note. So I did a series of records called Blue Bossa, Blue Bop, and Baptist Beat. I did 4 or 5 of those records, and they were kind of the beginnings of the major labels understanding how that there was a new market of kids who were discovering that music through the DJs. So that was one thing I was doing, the comps. That led to me setting up record labels. But I've done over sort of, I think, 150 official compilation albums, which would have led to that period where, from your name being in small letters at the back of the sleeve, to being invited as the DJ to be the sort of the front of the sleeve. And the first compilation I did like that was a series called Journeys by DJs. And funnily enough, being in Detroit, one of the tracks on that album was the very first ever Theo Parrish release. It was on that compilation. By the sky, but to the skies. But it's a good one actually. Still sounds good today. For me, it was compilations. It was doing record companies, record labels, putting bands in the studio. So I was learning about the different crafts all at the same time, and and the radio was kind of being on the radio was kind of like, for me to be relevant on the radio, to have sense, it only made sense because I was DJing 5 nights a week, running record labels, doing comps, and building a community around the music. And that's really what I've done ever since.
Incredible. Incredible. I really do love that image of sort of like drug dealing music to kids, like opening up your backpack and having these compilations and be like, no, you want to hear this. Check this out. You've got a few records up here. Are these things that you've put out and worked on?
I just bought them for everyone who's come, but that's just some new releases that I managed to get over here. So, I mean, it's not all that we're doing, but I run a label now called Brownswood Recordings. I told this story on the radio with you the other day, but so the first major label I had was Acid Jazz, and then I set up a label called Talking Loud after that. And the reason I set that label up was because the scene that we had at that time was still very small, and it needed to grow internationally. And so to do that, I needed to tap into a major, because the majors could get us around the world at that time. So that's why I left Acid Jazz to grow in its own way, but it needed someone to light the flame for the global movement. So that's why, in a way, I was in a position that was impossible not to do, which was to sort of work with a major, which was quite tricky at the beginning because I was so independently minded in everything that I'd done. And suddenly I was working at Polygram, Universal, and I was in an A&R department, and half the A&R team were talking about Def Leppard and Metallica and Elton John, and I was in that kind of world. And even though I was brought in initially with a lot of enthusiasm, as soon as I walked in after a few weeks, I realized that this is a whole different game to putting records out from your bedroom. And I spent the next 2 or 3 years pretty much on the edge of a nervous breakdown, learning about the industry from that side. But again, with time, those years of experience have been gratefully accepted by me, because I can see kind of both sides and understand both sides. And one of those sides was basically releasing records and then going to America with my records, because I had all these interesting groups. I had an artist called Omar. I had a group called the Young Disciples, who actually, when I went to People's Records the other day, they had a copy of the record, American promo of it, which I'd never had. I paid $30 for it. Worth every penny. a band called Young Disciples, a band called Galliano, and a band called Incognito. That was my first wave of groups that I had signed to Talking Loud. And we did very well in Europe and stuff, but we weren't really making the numbers that you need, the sufficient numbers to really impress Polygram. Until I had a hit in America. But before I had that hit, I would come to America so I'd turn up, to the Mercury building in New York, where I suddenly realized that the white people worked in that department and the black people worked in that department, and it was like, but I'm bringing a mixture of white and black. Which department shall I go to? And there was the rock guys pulling me in one way, and luckily for me, the people who were running Mercury at the time, the dance department, or the urban, whatever they called it back then, was Ed Eckstein, Guy Eckstein, son of Ed Eckstein, and a woman called Lisa Cortez, who's an amazing person who's gone on to become a big documentary producer in America. And they really liked what I was bringing, and they really tried to champion Talking Loud to America. So I was suddenly coming to America, and they were releasing my records in America, which was kind of unheard of at the time. So Young Disciples were getting released, Incognito were getting released, but they weren't quite crossing over. And the label, after 4 or 5 years, was beginning to kind of go through a moment of drift. We weren't quite hitting those targets. And suddenly I got a call from Lisa Cortez, and she goes, Giles, it looks like Incognito are going to have a hit in America. And I was like, wow, that's amazing, And she said, you've got to come over, and we're going to go to see them in America, and they're playing in Detroit. So I came over, and I was expecting to see Incognito, in a space maybe 1,000 people at best, and but that would have been great. And I came to Detroit, first time I think ever, and they were playing in a stadium, and there was like 15,000 people, and I think Anita Baker was on as well, and it was like it was straight into that world. And it was like, oh my gosh, this is different, And then I realized that making it in America didn't mean making it all across America. We were big in Detroit, but that was big enough, That was big enough, and that was really good. And that basically gave the label the impetus and the support from the major for me to then go and sign a bunch of new groups. And that's when I ended up signing another group from Detroit, which was Carl Craig with the Inner Zone Orchestra. I signed Kenny Dope and Louis Vega as masters at work on a project called New Eureka Soul. And
played it the other day.
Yeah, and I signed a project. The other group, I signed a bunch of UK acts, Ronnie Size Represent and Four Hero. But I also, not many people know this, but I also tried to sign the Roots. And I came to New York. They just put out a record on their own independent label called Organics out of Philly, and they basically, I was playing this record in my clubs, Organics. We managed to get some vinyl, and it was a CD, and we cut dub plates of the track. This band from Philly who were mixing jazz and rap, but in a really dynamic way that you could play in the club. And there was a track on this CD called The Session. It was kind of their version of Rapper's Delight. And it was incredible. It was like a 15-minute piece, wonderful stuff. And again, flipping this back to the clubs, as a DJ, the way you made your name as a DJ, I think it's pretty much still the same today in a way, but it was more direct then, is you made your name as a DJ because you had songs other people didn't have. You had cuts that other people didn't have, and what you'd do is you'd get the cuts, and you'd get the DATs, the DATs from the producers, and you'd go and cut an acetate, and then you'd come to your party. So I would go to the parties with a bunch of acetates and a bunch of really what were rare records, so a mixture of rare groove, selector music, and electronic dub-plated music. And there was one club I was doing during this period called That's How It Is every Monday in London, with a guy called James Lavelle who set up a label called Mo Wax, who signed DJ Shadow and all these people. And both he and I would come in every Monday with like a suitcase full of weapons. And we were basically, he'd play a brand new Massive Attack track that no one would hear. I would play a brand new Pesce track or a brand new Four Hero track. He would then play a brand new Shadow track, and it was that kind of time. And one of my weapons at the time was this track by a group called The Roots, and it was called The Session. And I'll never forget his face when I dropped it. It was like, I'd won that night easily. And so from that moment onwards, I was like, I really want to sign these guys. And it was the other thing that's quite interesting about where we stand in the UK is that, weirdly enough, a lot of American groups that were coming slightly from the left in America, they couldn't find the radio or the champions in America at the time because everything was a lot more straightforward. So a lot of them came to the UK, or it was the UK and Europe that would be the ones that would champion a lot of these groups, whether that's Mos Def, whether that's MF Doom, whether that's, some of the native tongues type of stuff, a little bit of that stuff would really come through Europe, a lot of it. And The Roots was a classic example of that. And so we were playing it, and then I went over to America to try and meet up with The Roots, and somehow they managed to say, yes, we'll meet you. And we met in the Paramount Hotel in New York. And I had an infection of my tooth, which I'll never forget, and my mouth was out like this. And the band met me in reception. Richard Nichols, who was the manager, who's no longer with us, unfortunately, and Questlove. And I said to them, "Hi, I'm this bloke from London. I want to put your record out." And they looked at me, and my face was like that. And they said, "Well, we really feel for you. We really appreciate you coming all this way, but we've just signed to Geffen." So I was like, "Oh, that's a shame." But at least they came to the meeting. But then what happened was, Geffen, they realized that America wouldn't get The Roots yet. America wasn't ready for The Roots. So Wendy Goldstein, who was the A&R person at Geffen, she called me up and she goes, "I'll tell you what, can you put out a mini album on Talking Loud just to get the ball rolling?" So that's what we did. There was a couple of extra tracks using British rappers on it. Funnily enough, it's worth looking out for this. And then they spent a year in London, The Roots, and they lived pretty much in my office. And they used London as their base to go traveling and to do all the touring around Europe, because that was really what they needed to do, to then bring the story back to America. And then that became part of the story, and then they released Do You Want More, and then the rest is history. They became what they became. But so this one Incognito hit in Detroit, Deep Waters, allowed me to be able to have so much fun and have a new wave of artists that took the label and the movement to another level, in a way.
Incredible. Yeah, no, yeah, please. Questlove has told that story a little more desperately, where he was like, we were going to Europe and it needed to work, or we weren't going to work, So thank you for giving us The Roots. We appreciate that.
For the first remix they ever did, I don't think they admit it, but the first remix they did was a group of mine called Galliano, who were just about to put a new album out after 30 years out. And if you look up in Discogs, they're not called The Roots, they're just called Roots. Galliano Roots Mix is The Roots. It's their first ever remix. They had no money left in London, and I gave them a few £100 to do a remix. There's a heavy snare on it.
I did like the phrasing. I think everyone in this room will like the phrasing that you used when you were at WDET. You said, "Detroit saved me." That hit saved you. Was able to keep you going. That's kind of been the insane thing, like kind of like a shared thing, because I know Detroit music has certainly influenced you, and I think every time I've listened to your show on BBC Radio 6, it's been some sort of Detroit music represented on there. Can you talk a little bit about your sort of taste for Detroit music? What makes it special?
I mean, I don't really know. It's not particularly Detroit or Chicago or New York. It just happens to be that there's been so much incredible music that's been made here that I was slow on techno though, right? Because while I was doing the acid jazz thing, in a way, all these other dance music had been born in a way. 1988 was when it kind of went from being phase one of underground clubs and pirate radio and DJing to suddenly a bunch of guys going to Ibiza. I was actually on that trip, and this guy called Nicky Holloway, he organized these events and these holidays where he'd bring over 300 ravers from England, and we'd go and DJ. He'd do a party in at the History Museum or in London Zoo, or really interesting events. And he basically organized a week for a few hundred kids to go to Ibiza. And they all took ecstasy there that time. There was 4 people who took ecstasy, 4 DJs. There was Danny Ramplin, there was Paul Oakenfold, there was Johnny Walker, and there was Nicky Holloway. And I didn't take an E. I didn't take it. And because we were strictly weed. And we're like, we're not doing that. And they all took it. And that's when it all changed, because those guys brought that back, and they suddenly had the music and the drug. And the music was this new music coming from Chicago and coming from Detroit, and suddenly you had clubs like Shoom opening up in the UK, and clubs like Sin, and what was going on in Manchester at the Hacienda. And that was basically based on this formula. And it became huge, right? And it kind of took dance music to a new level. And I was still playing my acid jazz records, and it wasn't really until 808 State came up with a song called Pacific State, and things like Can You Feel It from Fingers Inc., Larry Heard, tracks like that I was going, hang on, this is really going to fit into my sets. And so, but that was probably a couple of years later, I mean, I remember a moment when acid tracks, future acid tracks came out or had been around, and we used to have our dancers who'd come to follow us as DJs, and one of my regular dancers, it was all about dancing, right? And so a lot of the events that I was playing at, there'd be 2 rooms. There'd be like a bigger room, and there'd be the small room, and I was often in the smaller room because I was playing the weirder music, right? The less mainstream, and we play a lot of jazz and a lot of energy music in that way. And I remember at this one event back in 88, 89, I went into I was looking for my dancers, and I was like, they haven't come into my room yet. And I went into the main room, and one of the jazz dancers was dancing to future acid tracks. He was basically jazz dancing, break dancing to it. And I was like, whoa, that's interesting. So that's basically when I understood the power of that music in a different way. And actually, it wasn't until I signed 4Hero and Digo from 4Hero said to me, you've got to listen to this track, Underground Resistance, this group called Underground Resistance. And he introduced me to all of that stuff. So it had been going around for a little bit by then, and so suddenly, you've got all this new music to deal with, because you had all the stuff coming out of Chicago, you had the stuff coming out of Detroit, and then all the stuff that we were really focusing on in the UK. We had our own scene and our own music. And so already then, in 88, 89, there was already quite a lot of music to kind of pick from. And now 40 years or 30 years later, that's been multiplied by many, many times.
What is exciting you out of Detroit right now?
Oh, I mean, I mean, I'll see tonight, right?
Yeah.
I'll see tonight. I mean,
D'Angelo Marsh, Kato,
yeah. I
Tammy
mean,
Lackus.
yeah. And D'Angelo, I like a lot. I like Marcellus Pittman a lot. I mean, there's a flow here, right? It's just it's good to see that there's an understanding of the history, and I mean these guys are incredible. Someone was asking me the other day, how come Broken Beat, which is a kind of continuation of acid jazz, meets jungle, how come that wasn't bigger than it was? And at the end of the day, it's because any movement needs leaders, or it needs communicators, ambassadors, and Broken Beat didn't really have great ambassadors. The group, the sort of superstar group, Bugs in the Attic, didn't really work out. I mean, the music's, if you say to me, what's the best British music ever to happen, I'd say it's probably Broken Beat or Jungle. I mean, Jungle, in a way, I think is the one that it's never going to go away, and it's amazing. But Broken Beat is an incredible little thing. But here in techno, you had some really important people who could kind of spread the message globally. Whether it's characters and sort of fun oddballs, or whether it's just real great intellectual communicators. And so whether you're talking Jeff Mills, or whether you're talking, Kenny Dixon Jr., or whether you're talking Carl Craig, these people have got, there's an academicness to it all, which makes it, very interesting on a lot of levels. And there's always been that here. So, but I mean, at the end of the day, for me, Carl is very important, because I've kind of lived with Carl through his career from the beginning. Whereas the very first Belleville 3 kind of vibe, I was still focusing more probably, until Strings of Life. When Strings of Life came out, everyone played that record. Whatever scene you were playing in the UK, you played Strings of Life. It was like, it was a jazz house record in a way. And so it worked for us. But really, for me, the person who really kind of I follow, and I love the risks he takes. Obviously, the work he's done with the jazz legends, whether it's Tribe, whether it's Buggin', whether it's the Tribe stuff, or the Detroit Experiment, or whether he's working with a classical orchestra, or whether he's doing a synthesizer thing. I mean, yesterday to see Wendell and Carl Craig just doing it with Carl just playing ambient synths, electronica, beatless music, and Wendell just totally knowing how to fit around it. And just to think, my God, 40, 50 years ago, Wendell Harrison was doing that with Grant Green. He was going around, playing in an organ quartet to dancers, with his saxophone. I was like, that's quite amazing. But that's a Wendell story. But the fact that Carl sees all of that, obviously Mike Banks, and fundamentally, in a way, the one I tried to interview this week, but I got a negative, was the Electrifying Mojo. He's the one that everyone talks about, and I see that that's one big part of why there was a differentness to how music was taken in and created in this city. I think it doesn't take much. One radio station that mixes Frank Zappa with, disco, with free jazz, with, MC5 or the Stooges. I don't know if you played that, but I can just, I get the sense that, it was non-conformist radio. And again, for me, one of the stations that was really important for me to hear as a young person was going to Paris and listening to a station called Radio Nova when I was like in my late teens and early 20s. And I'd hear a radio station that everyone would listen to that was on, in the cabs and in the hotels and everything. And they would be mixing, Afro-Cuban music, with disco, with electro, with free jazz in the daytime. And I was like, that's got to be the way forwards.
It's been really incredible to have you here this week as part of this residency. Last night with Carl Craig, Wendell Harrison, and John Dixon. My God, absolutely magical. Going to be magical tonight, the Next Gen Showcase. That's going to be happening here starting at 9 o'clock. Giles tomorrow for 5 hours going through this mastermind's brain. Absolutely incredible. So, Giles, I just want to thank you so much. And I want to thank everybody for coming out and enjoying this. I know he's got some records. He's still dealing the drugs of music here, folks. It's in his blood.